Imagine waking in a Pacific Northwest logging camp on a winter morning in 1907. Your hand throbs where the cable caught it yesterday. 2 fingers mangled, bone showing through torn skin. The camp boss stands over your bunk, holding a tin cup. Whiskey. The smell cuts through sawdust and sweat. Behind him, nailed to the bunkhouse wall, the rules are clear. No outside liquor, violators dismissed. But this isn't your whiskey. It's theirs. Kept locked in the commissary. Dispensed for medical purposes only. He pours it on the wound. You bite down, tasting blood and bark. Then he makes you drink. The burn spreads through your chest as the system becomes clear. They banned your bottle to keep you sober for work, then used theirs to keep you working through pain. By the time you understood the difference, you'd already bled enough to need it. By the fall of 1905, logging operations in the Cascade Range had become industrial machines, consuming trees and men with equal efficiency. You arrived at camp after 2 days on foot, 60 miles from the nearest town where a saloon might offer relief. The weight of your pack had left bruises across your shoulders. Your boots were already falling apart. The foreman read the regulations on your first morning, his voice flat and practiced. No spirits, no beer, no wine. Immediate termination. The reason given was safety, discipline, productivity. Men had been known to fall from springboards 3 stories up, to misjudge a cut and get crushed when a tree barber chaired. Drunk workers were dead workers, the foreman explained. The company could not afford the risk. You nodded, you agreed, you needed the work. The bunkhouse tour came next. 40 men sleeping shoulder to shoulder on rough-cut bunks, wet wool drying on lines strung between posts, the air thick with body heat and pine smoke. Kerosene lamps hung from ceiling beams, their light barely reaching the corners. No privacy, no quiet, no escape. Some men had been there for years, their faces weathered to leather, their hands scarred beyond counting. The nearest hospital was 2 days by wagon, assuming the roads were passable, assuming you could afford the trip, assuming the company would let you leave. The company made that clear too. If you got hurt, you stayed. They would take care of you, their way. The company store sat at the center of camp like a locked vault. You learned the script system fast, wages paid in company currency, good only at company prices. Tobacco, beans, boots, all marked up 30, 40, sometimes 50% above what you would pay in town. But town was 60 miles away, and your scrip was worthless there anyway. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Work a month, earn your wages, spend it all at the store, end the month deeper in debt than when you started. Men called it wage slavery, but quietly, and never within earshot of the foreman. Behind the counter, mounted on the wall like a trophy, sat a locked cabinet. Whiskey. You saw it used for the first time 3 days after arrival. A cable tender named Morrison caught his hand between a choker and a log being dragged to the landing. The weight was tremendous, several tons of Douglas fir moving fast. The bones made a sound like green wood snapping. Morrison's scream cut through the engine noise, through the crash of timber, through every conversation in camp. Work stopped. The donkey puncher killed the engine. Men gathered in a circle, silent, knowing. Morrison sat on the ground, his right hand twisted at an impossible angle, fingers crushed to pulp. He wasn't crying. Shock, probably. The camp cook, a man named Henderson, who served as doctor because he'd once worked in a hospital kitchen, unlocked the cabinet with ceremony. He handled the bottle like it was sacred. He poured whiskey directly onto Morrison's crushed fingers. Morrison screamed then, the kind of scream that empties your lungs and doesn't stop when you breathe in again. Then Henderson made him drink. 3 long pulls from the bottle, whiskey running down Morrison's chin, mixing with tears and snot. "For medical purposes," Henderson said, his voice carrying the weight of gospel truth. The phrase would be written in the injury log, copied into the company ledger, used to justify the expense. Morrison was back on the cables within a week, 2 fingers splinted with barrel staves and twisted wire. He couldn't grip properly anymore. He couldn't do the work he'd been hired for. But he could assist, could help rig chokers, could make himself useful enough to justify keeping him on until his debt was paid. You watched. You learned the system. The whiskey was there for injuries serious enough to stop work, but not serious enough to end employment. The sweet spot between minor and fatal. That's where the company's mercy lived. Men stayed for reasons that made sense only when you had no other options. Debt piled up faster than wages. The company store saw to that. A pair of caulk boots cost a week's wages. A wool shirt, 2 days. Beans and bacon, coffee and tobacco. All of it added up. All of it tracked in ledgers that men couldn't read or dispute. By the end of your first month, you might owe more than you'd earned. By the end of the season, leaving wasn't a choice anymore. It was a financial impossibility. Seasonal desperation drove the cycle. Immigrants arrived speaking little English, desperate for any work. Drifters came from played-out mines and finished railroad contracts. Farm boys showed up after bad harvests, thinking timber work couldn't be worse than starving. They were wrong, but by the time they learned that, they were already trapped. Geographic isolation did the rest. 60 miles might as well have been 600 when you were paid in scrip and owed the company store more than you'd ever earn. The alcohol ban made sense on paper. Drunk workers meant accidents. Accidents meant lost productivity, damaged equipment, slower quotas. The temperance movement sweeping the country in the early 1900s provided moral cover. Respectable companies didn't allow drinking. But you saw the real reason in the locked cabinet, in Morrison's splinted fingers, in the careful rationing of relief. Recreational drinking meant independence. It meant a man might drink because he wanted to, because he was cold or lonely or terrified. It meant unpredictability, loss of control, the possibility that workers might bond over shared bottles and shared grievances. The company couldn't have that. Medical whiskey was different. Medical whiskey meant the company decided who hurt enough to deserve it, who was valuable enough to waste supplies on, who would live and who would die. Control in its purest form. You learned the jobs fast because you had to. Timber fallers worked in pairs, cutting the giants. Buckers sectioned the fallen logs. Choker setters wrapped cables. Donkey punchers ran the steam engines. The bull cook managed the bunkhouse. The camp boss managed everything else. Everyone had a role. Everyone was replaceable. The domestic routine settled in like a chronic ache. Wake before dawn. Work until dark. Eat heavy because you'd burn it all by noon. Sleep hard because tomorrow would be the same. Winter intensified everything. The trees were in sap, easier to cut but heavier to move. The ground turned to frozen mud that could break an ankle in the dark. The cold bit through wet wool and leather, numbing fingers and toes, making every task harder and more dangerous. Men worked through it because stopping meant losing wages, and losing wages meant deeper debt. The whiskey wasn't there to help you. It was there to keep you working. That was the truth Morrison learned, that every man in camp would eventually learn. The company's mercy had limits, and those limits were defined by profit. You woke before dawn to the bull cook's yell, a sound that cut through sleep like an axe through sapwood. No mercy in it, no negotiation. 5 a.m, still dark, still cold. You pulled on wet clothes. They never fully dried in the bunkhouse humidity, and stumbled to the mess hall where breakfast waited, sobelly and beans, bread and coffee that tasted like boiled bark. You ate fast, you ate heavy, because in 2 hours, none of it would matter except the fuel it provided. Tool distribution happened in the pre-dawn dark, each man taking his assigned equipment from the tool shed. Crosscut saws, misery whips, the men called them, stretched 6 to 8 feet long, heavy as sin, requiring 2 men to operate effectively. Double-bitted axes, with handles worn smooth from 1,000 hands. Iron wedges heavy enough to crack bone if dropped. Steel springboards for standing high enough on the trunk to cut above the swollen base. Every tool was a potential weapon. Every tool had killed someone somewhere. Timber fallers worked in pairs, a rhythm learned through repetition and enforced by fear. You pulled one end of the saw, your partner pulled the other. Back and forth, back and forth. Never push. Pushing binds the blade, breaks teeth, can snap the whole saw, and send steel shards into flesh. The rasp of steel teeth biting into wood became the soundtrack of survival, a sound that would follow you into dreams, that you'd hear in quiet moments for the rest of your life. Reading the tree meant watching everything: the crown lean, the wind direction, the surrounding timber. You looked for dead branches that could fall during cutting, widowmakers that killed more men than the trees themselves. You judged the weight distribution, planned the escape route, calculated angles that meant the difference between a clean fall and catastrophe. Get it wrong, and the tree could split vertically up the trunk, a barber chair that launched tons of timber backward like a catapult. Men had been cut in half by barber chairs, crushed, impaled on their own saws. Minor injuries were routine. Splinters driven deep into hands and arms, some the size of pencils, working their way toward bone and blood vessels. Cuts that bled but didn't hit arteries, that could be wrapped with torn cloth and ignored. Strains that turned into limps that became permanent disabilities. These didn't earn whiskey. Not serious enough, the foreman would say, barely looking up from his tally book. You learned what serious meant. Bone deep, bleeding heavy, unable to work. Only then did the locked cabinet open. The cold numbed your fingers, made it hard to grip the saw handles, turned every swing of the axe into a gamble. The sweet smell of fresh-cut cedar mixed with sweat and fear, and the sharper scent of sap bleeding from wounded wood. Your back ached by mid-morning. Your shoulders burned. Your hands cramped around the saw until you couldn't tell where the tool ended and your flesh began. You saved the whiskey for when you really needed it. The company made sure of that. Because whiskey meant injury, meant lost time, means questions about whether you were worth keeping on. Better to work hurt, work scared, work through pain that should stop you. Better to stay off the company's radar, out of the injury logs, away from Henderson and his locked cabinet and his gospel phrase about medical purposes. Before we continue, if you believe these men deserve to be remembered, that their sacrifice built the world we live in today, hit that subscribe button, but only if you truly mean it. America's railroads demanded timber. Cities demanded lumber. The nation's growth demanded quotas that turned forests into graveyards. By 1906, the Cascade operations were cutting old-growth Douglas fir at a pace that required speed over caution, volume over safety. Why did America's growth demand so much blood? Because the alternative was slower profits, and in the company ledgers, slow profits and dead workers occupied the same column: acceptable losses. Mid-morning on a Tuesday in November 1906, a faller named Peterson misjudged his undercut. The tree, a Douglas fir maybe 200 feet tall, 8 feet across at the base, didn't fall clean when they completed the back cut. It hung, caught in the branches of neighboring trees, swaying with the wind. A widowmaker in the most dangerous form. Standard procedure was to walk away. Let the rigging team handle it with cables and the steam donkey, pulling from a safe distance. Everyone knew this. It was in the rules, the same rules that banned alcohol. But the foreman was watching from the landing, and the morning quota was not met. Falling behind meant pressure. Pressure meant longer hours, harder work, lost bonuses that men were counting on. Peterson climbed. He used his springboard pegs to work his way up the hung tree's trunk, carrying an axe, planning to cut free the branches holding it. 40 feet up, maybe 50, high enough that the ground looked far away. A dead branch, cedar rot hidden under bark, gave way beneath his boot. Peterson fell. Not the tree. The man. His shoulder hit a stump on the way down. The sound carried across the cutting area, across the landing, all the way to the bunkhouse. A wet crunch that was too thick to be wood, too loud to be anything but bone. Work stopped for exactly 5 seconds. Men looked, assessed, decided. Then the whistle blew. Back to it. They brought Peterson to the commissary because he could not walk, and Henderson worked there. The cook turned doctor unlocked the cabinet with ceremony, the same ritual you had seen with Morrison. Whiskey poured directly into the wound where Peterson's collarbone had torn through skin and muscle. The scream was immediate, raw, the kind that echoes. Then Henderson made Peterson drink, forced the bottle between his teeth until whiskey ran down his throat, until he stopped fighting and started shaking, until the alcohol hit his bloodstream and the pain became something distant and floating. Historical records confirm this was standard frontier medicine in logging camps. Alcohol as antiseptic, as anesthetic, as the only option when doctors were days away and work could not wait. The injury report later filed noted Peterson was treated and returned to duty. Returned within a week, his shoulder roughly splinted, his arm strapped to his chest, unable to pull a saw or swing an axe, but capable of helping buck fallen logs, of guiding timber, of making himself useful enough to justify keeping him on payroll and in debt. You watched them pour company whiskey into his wound. You understood what you'd bought for him. Another week of labor, maybe 2, however long it took for the injury to heal enough for real work, or for infection to set in and end the question permanently. The previous winter, a man named Sullivan was caught with a personal flask. Found it during a random bunkhouse inspection, tucked in his bedroll between wool blankets. Half full, cheap stuff, probably bought on his last trip to town before the season started. The foreman held it up like evidence at a trial, made Sullivan stand in front of the assembled workers at dinner. Fired him on the spot, marched him to the camp boundary with orders never to return. Sullivan tried to argue. He'd never drunk on the job, never showed up impaired, kept the flask for evenings and Sundays when work was done. It didn't matter. The rules were the rules. The same substance that saved Peterson condemned Sullivan. The difference was control. Company whiskey came measured, rationed, tracked in ledgers with the precision of ammunition in wartime. Every pour was documented. Every dose was a decision made by management, by Henderson, by the foreman, by someone with authority over your body and your pain. They decided when you hurt enough. They decided what injury merited treatment. They decided if you lived or died, and they made that decision based on quotas and productivity, and whether keeping you alive was cheaper than hiring your replacement. Personal whiskey represented something else: independence, unpredictability, the possibility that a man might drink for reasons other than survival. Might drink because he wanted to, because he was cold, or scared, or bone-tired, because whiskey was one of the few pleasures available in a camp 60 miles from anything resembling civilization. Personal whiskey meant you controlled your own relief, your own comfort, your own decisions about what your body could endure. The company couldn't have that. Camp violence told its own story. Men fought over debts, over imagined slights, over the crushing weight of exhaustion and isolation. They fought because fighting was something they could control, because hitting someone felt like power, when everything else in their lives was powerlessness. The injuries from these fights also earned whiskey. Same cabinet, same ceremony, same control. Split knuckles got wrapped, broken ribs got taped. A man knocked unconscious got whiskey poured down his throat until he woke up or stopped breathing. You could bleed for the company and receive their mercy, but drink for yourself? Gone. Sullivan's bunk was filled the next day by a new man who didn't know the story yet, who would learn it eventually, who would understand that the company's mercy came with terms and conditions that were non-negotiable. Evening conversations in the bunkhouse carried a bitter humor. Men spoke in low voices after the lamps went out, when the darkness made truth easier. "They'll give you whiskey to die slower," one old-timer said, a bucker who'd been in the woods for 15 years and had the scars to prove it, just not to live better. Another man laughed, a sound without joy. "Difference is, dying slower means more work gets done. Living better doesn't profit nobody but you." Records from survivor memoirs confirm the irony wasn't lost on the workers. They understood the system, they just couldn't escape it. The steam donkey changed everything and nothing. Introduced in the 1880s, these portable steam engines used cables and pulleys to drag logs that would have required teams of oxen and weeks of labor. The machinery created new roles: donkey punchers who operated the engines, cable tenders who managed the lines, choker setters who wrapped steel cables around massive logs. The work was faster, more efficient, more profitable, also more deadly. The physics of cable work were simple and lethal. A cable under tension, pulling tons of timber across rough ground, holds enormous energy. When it snaps from overload, from a hidden flaw in the steel, from simple bad luck, it whips back faster than thought, faster than reflex. In 1908, at a camp near Eugene, Oregon, a cable severed 3 fingers from a choker setter's left hand. The break was clean, almost surgical. Steel moving at killing speed doesn't tear, it cuts. They brought him to Henderson. The cook performed the amputation with a handsaw, using whiskey as the only anesthetic. A survivor's account preserved in later interviews records the moment with devastating simplicity. "They gave me the bottle and told me to bite down." The whiskey made the impossible bearable. That was the trap. Pain relief and control were the same thing. Inseparable. 2 sides of a coin that always landed company side up. Evenings in the bunkhouse, men compared scars like maps of survival. Each mark represented a moment when company whiskey had been deemed necessary. Missing fingers were common enough to be unremarkable. The company store kept a separate ledger for medical supplies. Some camps charged workers for the whiskey used in treatment, adding injury costs to the debt that kept them trapped. The camp hospital was a bunk in the corner, separated by canvas. Infections were common, no antibiotics, whiskey's antiseptic properties limited. Men died from injuries modern medicine would consider routine. Frostbite treatment, whiskey externally and internally. Hypothermia, forced whiskey consumption before sending men back to work. Sometimes it helped, often it didn't. The company's calculus was simple. Whiskey cost less than doctors, took less time than hospital transport. You learned to measure severity by how much whiskey they'd give you. Company ledgers examined later showed expenses for medical whiskey that amounted to a fraction of what actual medical care would have cost. But actual medical care would have required acknowledging the work itself was the injury, that the system was designed to break bodies for profit. The pattern became clear. The alcohol ban served behavioral control. Medical whiskey served a different purpose, keeping injured workers functional. Speed quotas didn't decrease when men were hurt. Foremen were promoted on board feet produced, not worker safety. Whiskey rationing meant the camp boss controlled pain management itself, deciding who hurt enough to deserve relief. Workers who complained received less whiskey, more pressure. Replacement workers were always available. By some accounts, in certain camps, 1 in 5 men suffered serious injury during a single season. The whiskey wasn't medicine. It was the cheapest way to keep broken men working. Spring brought log drives. River pigs rode floating timber, using pike poles to break jams. The dangers: drowning, crushing, hypothermia. Company policy mandated whiskey for men who went in the water. The medical belief held that alcohol warmed the body. This was dangerously wrong. Alcohol creates warmth while increasing heat loss. Men shivering in wet clothes, given whiskey, sent back to the river. A survivor's testimony from a 1912 labor commission. They gave us whiskey and told us to get back on the logs. Half of us couldn't feel our feet. We went anyway. Drowning rates among warmed workers were documented but rarely questioned. They gave you whiskey to survive the work. The work killed you anyway. When whiskey wasn't enough, men died. Crushed torsos, severed limbs, head trauma. These became death sentences. The 2-day journey to real hospitals meant most never made it. Company investigations followed a pattern. Blame the worker. The whiskey used medically became evidence of intoxication. Families were told loved ones died under the influence. Compensation denied, citing alcohol policies. Medical whiskey became proof of recreational drinking, which absolved the company, which saved money for more whiskey for the next injury. Labor organizing attempts were met with blacklisting. Men who complained found themselves disappeared. There was nowhere to go, no recourse that didn't answer to the same owners who profited from the system. The Progressive Era brought investigations, exposés, complications. As Prohibition approached, some camps went completely dry. Death rates didn't improve. Excuses just changed. New tools arrived: chainsaws, better cables, mechanization. The legacy was already written. Ghost camps remained in the mountains, marked by rusted equipment and bottles buried with bones. Company documents examined decades later showed whiskey expenses tracked, lives saved none, profits maintained. By the time real doctors appeared in camps, entire forests had fallen. The men who cut them were gone. The timber still stands, framing houses in Seattle and Portland. The contradiction was never resolved, just rendered irrelevant by economics and technology. Medical whiskey wasn't mercy. It was maintenance. When you see old-growth lumber in historic buildings, remember the men who had no choice between their bottle and the company's. The difference was never about safety. It was about power. They really did ban alcohol while serving whiskey. Same substance, different control. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. These camps existed across North America. Someone in your area probably worked one. What do you think? Was using whiskey as cheap medicine instead of providing real healthcare justified? Was the cost worth it, or could we have done better? Share your thoughts below.